Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to the Bloor Group's Research Webcast series. That's right, folks. We are wrapping up half a year, and frankly more than that, of detailed research into the world of Hadoop. It is the interactive research report on the Hadoop landscape. You can see we've got a bunch of sponsors here. Big thank you to our sponsors, including SAS, Actian, Think Big, which is a Teradata company, Attunity, Waterline Data, Platfora, HP Security, Voltage. So lots of folks jumped on board to help us bring you this content free of charge. And obviously you out there play a significant role as well. So don't be shy. Feel free to send your questions in at any time, and we'll queue them up at the end of the webcast. So we have two presenters today. It's just yours truly, Eric Cavanaugh, your host, and our very own Dr. Robin Bloor, Chief Analyst here at the Bloor Group. Let's talk about where we came from and where we're going. So the exploratory webcast was earlier this year. This is how we do things in our interactive reports. We have a sort of a hypothesis webcast, which Dr. Bloor delivered back in January. Then we had a roundtable not that long ago with our good friend Mike Ferguson from Intelligent Business Strategies. You'll hear some kudos given to him throughout the show because he has such an interesting perspective and he really pays close attention to this business. And he's also a practitioner, so he's out there in the real world building solutions using these technologies, and therefore he can get way beneath the marketing language and actually talk about what really happens when you stitch all this stuff together. And it's a very interesting world out there, this whole Hadoop ecosystem. For those who are new to this issue or new to this industry, Hadoop, of course, is this open source framework that was started at Yahoo and then handed over to Google, and then Google turned it over to the open source community, the Apache Foundation specifically back in, I believe it was 2007. So we're in 2015. That means the Hadoop movement really started, more like 10 years ago or 11. The guy who came up with the idea, Doug Cutting, works at Cloudera these days. Lots of other folks, though, are working on this project, all these committers across all these different projects. It's this really fascinating environment that is fundamentally changing not just how data is wrangled and used in the world today, but also how the enterprise software industry itself works. It's really ground-shaking stuff, and we'll talk all about that in our show today. And, of course, this is the Findings webcast. We'll have a report that is almost finished, just a couple pages left to go, and we'll issue that probably first thing next week. So watch for that. And like I said, use Hadoop as a hashtag on Twitter, and we'll try to comment via social media. So one of my favorite expressions is well begun is half done. It says begin there, but that's just a typo that we missed. But well begun is half done is an old expression that basically means if you get off on the right track, if you start off properly with a project, you're kind of like half done. If you don't start off properly, you're going to have to be mending fences and fixing stuff and stitching together new solutions and Band-Aids and so forth. And there is a general perception with Hadoop that because you can just dump stuff into the HDFS, the highly distributed file system, that you don't really have to worry about how you do it. You hear this concept of a data lake talked about all the time these days. We prefer the term data reservoir because it connotes some organization and some importance on things like cleanliness, for example, in your drinking water as well as in your data, of course, because data that's bad is going to cause bad decisions. I don't think anybody misunderstands that. We all know what a serious issue it is. But the fact is that you really do have to pay attention to how you map out your own Hadoop strategy in your company. Certainly you want to focus on the business needs in play. But also keep in mind that there will be other needs that come down the pike, and you will want to be able to pivot and be agile and do other things down the road. So there are a couple things to keep in mind. A lot of people talk about this schema on read, which is a really important aspect of Hadoop. And the point is that in the data warehousing world, you had to come up with that schema first before you even loaded the data or did any of that stuff. It was really important that you knew which kinds of questions you'd be asking so you would know how to optimize the schema in order to get data quickly, do the number crunching you need to do in a timely fashion, and really enable that data access side of the equation. So let's kind of dig through this a bit. There are different file formats you can use, and there are different ways that you can set up your cluster or clusters. So you'll hear people talk about mixed workloads. I think probably Dr. Bloor would agree, and a lot of the people I talk to agree, that mixed workloads remain a very tricky situation for even these Hadoop clusters that we're talking about these days. So if you have, for example, a cluster that you want to focus on analytics and you want to do very deep analytics on that stuff, you're going to want to be careful about doing too many other types of transactional or operational types of things using this environment. And typically Hadoop, let's face it, was not really designed for transactional or operational systems, but we are starting to see it serve as what I once heard a guy call many years ago an enterprise backplane. So to mention Mike Ferguson again, he talked about a couple, I don't know, maybe 6-8 months ago or longer, he was talking about how he thinks one of the single biggest takeaways of this entire movement, of everything that's happening in the whole Hadoop ecosystem, is the foundation itself, HDFS, the highly distributed file system. Because guess what? Having an infinitely scalable file system that works and is free is a really pretty serious deal. It's a big deal. There's a lot more to it, of course. The whole massive parallel processing side is a really big part of what the Hadoop movement is. And also, I mentioned in here, think about the file format types that you use. There are different ways you can load data. You can load it as just flat files, CSV files, but you can also use this file format called Parquet, and they have ORC files. There are a lot of different things. You can look it all up on Wikipedia if you're bored. But these file structures are actually quite intelligent. And especially with Parquet, I believe it is, here's a file format that was specifically designed with analytics in mind. So that's not a small thing. It's kind of a big deal. And then I just say here, better safe than sorry. Pay close attention to security. We're going to learn some about that today. We've been learning even just recently from news from the field, so to speak, that there are huge security issues in Hadoop, and they're really only now being tidied up. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to the inimitable Dr. Robin Bloor. Correct me if I was wrong on anything, or just take it away.
Yes, you're completely correct about everything, I'm sure. It's you can say an awful lot of things about Hadoop as it actually happened, simply because at this point in time, I mean, and this is probably one of the findings of research, but it's not a formal finding of the research. It's like this stuff is really in flux, you know. It's not by any manner of means stable, and the longer we looked at it, I mean, we have spent 9 months looking at this. We've talked to pretty much everybody. Well, we talked to all of the sponsors for a kickoff, and we had long chats with them about their view of Hadoop and so on and so forth. But we also talked to a lot of other people. We get briefed every Friday by 3 or 4 companies, and pretty much, I don't know, 50% of the companies that come to us have got an interest in the Hadoop space nowadays. Extremely active space. The question really that we actually started out with is really, what is Hadoop? You know, apart from the obvious things, yes, you can go look it up on Wikipedia and it'll tell you that it's a highly scalable file system. That's not the point. The point is what position does it occupy within the world of IT as it's gradually developing. It's always been a moving target. And it's particularly right now a dramatically moving target, which, I mean, we will discuss that in a while, but, you know, the reason that the target is moving so fast, the changes that are taking place now are an awful lot faster than they used to occur at a technology level, at almost every level of technology, but particularly in corporate computing in the area of big data. Let's have a look at this. I'm going to talk about the Hadoop landscape, which is just, this is what we see happening. This is just really chatting about, you know, what we gradually got the impression of as the months went by and as we talked to various people. Then we want to talk about architecture and Hadoop, and then we want to talk about Hadoop going forward, which is pretty much trying to read the tea leaves, really. The illustration here is Ganesha, Hindu, God representing wisdom is probably what you would say. One of the odd things about Ganesha, I couldn't find an illustration of Ganesha that showed it, but I was told by somebody that knew Hinduism far better than I that Ganesha is always accompanied by a rat. And the idea of the rat is that the rat represents doubt and, you can't have wisdom unless you carry with you a certain amount of doubt. And that's one of the kind of things that manifested as I went through, or as we went through the various kinds of activities that we're doing this research, was just reevaluating again and again as to what the hell is actually going down here. It's fairly dramatic what's happening with Hadoop, is what I would say. So let's talk about the landscape, complete with elephants, I guess. This is you can find stuff like this on the web easily enough. There's nothing particularly unique about this one, other than that I could fit it onto a slide. But there are a few things that are takeaways from this. That the rate of growth of Hadoop is very, very quick. It's quite clear. Most of it's actually happening in North America. North America, roughly speaking, is probably about 30 or 40% of the world's IT. It's nothing more than that. But it's more than 50% of the usage of Hadoop. The open source thing is much stronger in North America than anywhere else in the world. Second strongest, I think, is Europe. Asia Pac, they haven't taken to open source in the same way yet, But it's quite clear that Hadoop, while it might be dominated by North American activity, it's genuinely a global phenomenon. It's very likely to become a huge market. And there are many people yet to commit, and we will go into that. One of the things that's likely to make it successful is the level of VC investment. It's incredibly high. The thing that happens with a situation where the VCs suddenly believe that there is going to be an awful lot of money made in a particular area, the money pours in, and as time goes by, company after company after company comes to market with technology that supports that particular sector. And Hadoop became one of those sectors quite a while ago, and it continues to be one of those sectors. So, one of the things that we could say, and I can say absolutely right now, is what's happened with this research that we've done, is it's just quite clear that the whole of the Hadoop environment is changing. There's nothing that I would regard as solid, to be honest. And we've seen that, and we'll kind of go and talk through. We've seen that, and we see it continuing. And that, in some way or other, it kind of makes one... It should make people in the corporate environment pause and think long and hard before they decide exactly what they're going to do with this technology. It isn't to say they're not going to use it. It's to say how we're going to use it, and how we're going to use it in such a way that, what we do now is going to be, it's going to look sensible in 5-6 years' time, which is probably the only level of horizon you can count on. This is the Hadoop evolution story, which I call the yarn story, because Hadoop was, it was a scale-out file system with a development platform on top of it called MapReduce, which was incredibly constrained, in my opinion, development environment. It could do serial batch workloads, and that was it. The data storage was versatile, especially in recovery from failure of any sort. It had key value access, and that was actually an advantage rather than a disadvantage, that it was only key value store, because the key value store has always been the most useful store that we ever had in the whole of IT. And it was an island of processing, and with the release of Yarn and the uncoupling of MapReduce, everything changed. Suddenly you could have multiple concurrent workloads. Admittedly, it's in its infancy. Admittedly, it'll have to get better. But you could run multiple algorithms at the same time, even on the same data. You could think in terms of optimized data storage, and certainly you could do things under the covers to do that. You could experience Sparkle, JSON, even SQL Sparkle and JSON access over Hadoop, in the sense that more and more components just appear in one way or another that will give you that kind of access. So you're not really dealing with a key value store anymore. You're dealing with a key value store that might be the physical component of something that's got a layer over it and behaves a bit more like a database. Admittedly, that kind of capability was there with HBase and Hive fairly early on, but it's getting more and more sophisticated now, because if you really want to have a database that functions on Hadoop, you can have one. Hadoop is now pretty well integrated with everything else in the data center, in the sense that you can reach out from Hadoop and send data anywhere or send messages anywhere. And Hadoop has become a brand. I kind of put that little note at the bottom. Here's the Apache ecosystem. It's like, first of all, I didn't get this chart from this table from someone else. I actually had to assemble it myself by going through various lists of various components of Hadoop. I think most of this, or perhaps all of it, is Apache. I meant it to all be Apache, so if I drop something in by accident that isn't Apache, my apologies. It looks like when you add the word Apache to this, and you look at all of these things, and you see what they all are, and by the way, I'm not going to read them all out. We'd be here all afternoon if I read them all out. But, if you actually look at all of this, you see that there is a vast number of components already, all open source components, all Apache components. I think I've listed 23 there or something. It may even be more than that. All of them related to the use of Hadoop in one way or another. This is an extraordinary thing, on its own. By the way, I've actually listed Cassandra and Couchbase, two databases that came out of this open source movement, also in there, just because I wanted to list all related things. This would give you the idea that in some way or other Apache was determining the destiny of Hadoop. And my opinion is that that isn't what's going on at all. However, they are actually overseeing, they seem to be doing a very good job of overseeing the development of a whole series of components. And every month or 2 months that goes by, I'm not listing here every single thing that could have been listed. I'm listing here a set of Apache projects, all of which are active, all of which have people who are, as the months go by, improving the capability of each of these components. I think that's true for everyone, and it certainly was when I created the list, because I checked that out, This isn't everything, and I'm about to go and talk about things like Presto and Kafka and Apex and lots of other things. This isn't everything. This is the stuff that is actually, in one way or another, under the auspices of Apache projects and is being developed in a particular way. The Hadoop itself, one of the interesting things I came across, somebody talking about a cloud vendor that was implementing Hadoop, but they were implementing Hadoop over HDFS, right? But the HDFS wasn't actually HDFS. They'd actually put their own file system underneath. They were just using HDFS API, which is kind of an interesting thing because, if you had... I have no idea whether it's better or not. I'm sure they're doing it for the sake of the economy, and I'm not going to name them because I was told that in kind of confidence, But they're a reasonably large cloud player and may become a large player in the Hadoop game, The number of data sources that use Hadoop is exploding. Was exploding, still is. Hadoop became a staging area for databases, even though it was mature. It became an archive. Let's go on to Spark. When MapReduce was unhitched from the HDFS, pretty soon, and there was a need, there was a necessity for some component to become the natural development platform, or seeing as there'd already been one development platform called MapReduce, become the next development platform, and it became Spark. And because of that, Spark, which was a UC Berkeley open source component initially, suddenly shot to prominence. And good reason for using something like Spark rather than MapReduce. MapReduce was really very much a disk-based environment. Spark allows you to do memory, and therefore you can make very good use of memory. And there had to be a general purpose platform that allowed you in one way or another to use all of the capabilities of the computers in the net. Spark's not really a streaming environment. Storm was written to become a streaming environment, you know. Some people are using Spark for streaming. I'm not sure whether that's a good idea. I've never tried doing it. I don't know what the technical gating factor would be. Spark has got DataStax, which is a dedicated support company. But recently, and I'll go on about this in a minute, it was challenged by DataTorrent with Apex, who've released something called Apex into open source, which actually does something very similar to what Spark does. It allows you to run stuff in memory, and DataTorrent claims that it goes much faster than Spark. And this is like a really interesting thing, you know. It's like Spark became a big deal sometime last year. I think everybody got very enthusiastic about it, and it seems to have got even more and more enthusiastic. But, you know, if someone has come and released into the open source space something that actually is an awful lot more, in the sense has been engineered much more for in-memory usage and appears to be faster in a lot of areas. I mean, that's what DataTorrent is claiming, and that's their business, so they're probably good at it. It possibly is. You know, if somebody's actually delivering this into the environment and you made a decision 6 months ago to go with Spark and you're looking over your shoulder and you're saying, well, maybe I shouldn't have done that. This is a fairly unstable environment. This is what we call the Hercules Effect. But named after Hercules, who Athena didn't take kindly to Hercules, and she sent 2 snakes to try and I'm not sure what kind of snakes they are. I think they were going to try and like boa constrictors. They're going to strangle him in his cot, you know. Anyway, he got hold of them both by the throats and killed them. Hercules was born fully formed and already a hero. What we're actually looking at is we're looking at a whole series of new, or say suddenly appearing components from various sources. They're nearly all, in actual fact, they've come from very large web companies. So you've got Kafka and Voldemort, that are gifts from LinkedIn. They were just thrown into the open source space. But they're thrown into the open source space after LinkedIn had used them in anger on its application, which is one of the largest scale-out applications for those 2 components that you're ever going to meet. Hadoop itself was thrown into open source by Yahoo. Yahoo has been working on Druid recently and has made it scale up beyond anybody's imagination. And Yahoo has a 600 petabyte implementation of Hadoop, would you believe? The idea of something that you thought was a component suddenly being worked on by a large number of very experienced and very well paid software engineers, and then suddenly finding itself in the open source space. You know, when we were in the world of Linux, we got used to the fact that open source just gradually got better and better. It didn't suddenly, from nowhere, get born like Hercules fully formed. A recent birth of that nature was Presto. Facebook just threw it out there. Presto is designed to be, it runs on Facebook's 300 petabyte data warehouse, which is implemented on Hadoop, and the idea is that it will get answers to queries back in seconds, minutes, sort of time frames. Really highly scalable and using the whole of the cluster to try and field the queries. The question is that going to destroy Hive? It's not as capable as Hive in terms of all the things it can do, but it's like, well, maybe you were doing something really strategic in your use of Hive, and all of a sudden Presto appears. What are you going to do? And then there's Parquet, and there's Mesos that came out of Twitter, and these aren't the only examples, you know. And this is actually very disruptive in a really strange way. The environment is suddenly getting more and more powerful by leaps and bounds. It didn't happen, if you got a database, you bought Oracle's database, or IBM's DB2 or Microsoft SQL Server, you didn't, with the next release, you didn't suddenly get something dramatically more powerful. But with Hadoop, you're just getting these components falling in that are very, very powerful. And it means that it's actually really quite difficult to make sense of the environment. It's not a stable environment. The fact that it's getting an awful lot stronger, an awful lot at remarkable speed, still, it's not a stable environment.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in. I'll chime in just real quick here for a second, because what you're talking about there is a very significant aspect of this ecosystem, just how fluid it is, and there you are with an aquatic photograph there. That has to make some of the traditional enterprise IT executives nervous. I mean, there are ways that you can, I guess, partition your Hadoop environment such that you do so organizationally, you do so in terms of how you're actually storing the data and using the data and so forth. But nonetheless, the magnitude of disruption that keeps coming strikes me as a very significant issue. And a quick side note, I made a mistake at the top of the hour, and we have to get one mistake in the slides here too, that it's Databricks that's behind Spark, not Data Stacks. But what do you think about...
Oh, damn.
We want to give credit where credit is due here. But if you think about from a purchasing perspective, if you are the CTO or CIO, or let's say you're a chief data officer at a very large organization, you need to be very careful about moving forward, and you have to keep your ear to the ground all the time, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's like with this one, it's, I think that's one of the reasons that the conclusions that I kind of come to at the end of the whole of this are much more much more tentative than I ever expected would be the case, So, and if you want to, by the way, Eric, if there are any other errors on the slides, if you want to kind of butt in, the ecosystem support, all of the people that are our sponsors, of course, provide complementary components. That's why, in one way or another, they were interested in sponsoring the research we've done. But all of them, SAS has built extremely fast in-memory stuff to set over Hadoop. Waterline has got some interesting metadata capture stuff. Teradata has been messing around with Hadoop for a long time, but recently said that in one way or another it is going to directly provide support for Presto, even if you're not a Teradata customer. So suddenly they become an open source support company, which I think is interesting. Action, it took its vectorized database and stuck it on Hadoop, and it's got data flow on Hadoop. HP's security, the voltage security company that HP acquired, has very, very specific security capabilities. Platform, Attunity, all of them, if you like, are pushing in further capability into the whole of the Hadoop environment. So we're looking at, a large number of components, and on top of that, you've got, and those are just our sponsors. If you actually look at them, Splice Machine, Pepper Data, Redpoint Global, WANDisco, we could reel off probably about 20 very interesting capabilities that you can actually get on Hadoop right now, which complement, the base. At the hardware level, almost everybody that's still in the hardware business, certainly Intel has an interest, but Teradata, IBM, HP, Dell, they all have special products that are for the Hadoop environment. The cloud vendors so far have very little interest. It doesn't seem like Hadoop is big in the cloud yet. And then we've got the ODP initiative. Indicates the strength of commercial interest. Really, when a whole series of vendors get together and try and sort out the direction of Hadoop. And this is the other thing that just became obvious as we went through the whole of looking at Hadoop, is that at the moment it's a ship of fools. It's like there's a different captain every 30 minutes of the ship. We have got no idea. There is no strategic direction to Hadoop because there's no one to say what that is, and until a collection of vendors and a kind of momentum dominates the field. And the fact that ODP has got together and it's got IBM and EMC and a whole bunch of other people behind it, in actual fact, doesn't guarantee that that's the direction of Hadoop yet. Until there's one dominant distribution that goes with that, and there's a kind of, if you like, someone could draw a reliable roadmap. I mean, have you ever seen a Hadoop roadmap? For the Hadoop ecosystem, there isn't one. We're left with the fact that this is a ship of fools, and that, in one way or another, means that I don't think you can be, in a corporate sense, I don't think you can be strategic with a big S about Hadoop, because we've got no idea what it's going to become. And this is one of the things. It's become very powerful, but beyond that, Hadoop's success, the estimates suggest there are 2,000 operational implementations. I believe that. I have no doubt in believing that. If you actually go and look at database companies, apart from ones that are decades old, any database company that started up in the past 15 years, right, I don't think there's a single one that's got 2,000 implementations. This is a big thing. I mean, the fact that you've got 2,000 operational Hadoop clusters out there means a big thing. However, it's still less than 1% of the IT shops out there. But having said that, it's very large companies. Pretty much every web business uses Hadoop to scale. That's one of the reasons that we're getting these incredible gifts of new software components dropping out of them. And many, many proof of concept and sandbox usages that are going on. Probably I couldn't find an estimate for either of those things. Extensive third-party support for Hadoop, including consultancy. Pretty much every big data consultancy is actually a Hadoop consultancy. And the ecosystem that exists out there, in terms of its depth and in terms of the number of components, it compares with almost any other ecosystem you want to think about. You can think in terms of any of the probably server companies you ever knew about, so the Oracles and the Suns and the Digitals and so on of this world. This is a very big ecosystem, and there's really no arguing with that. In terms of applications, the more we looked, the more we actually came to the conclusion that really this is about BI and analytics. That the reason for using Hadoop is it scales out very, very well. It scales out in an unprecedented way, and it's all been built for massive scale out. That means that it handles that kind of workload extremely well because it's data heavy. And if you actually look who's using it, pretty much those are all of the use cases we come across. There's nearly all, there are a few niche things, that has been used for video animation and things like that. But by and large, it's in that space. So I would classify that as like a third of corporate IT. The third being the stuff that we used to call the data warehouse and data flow. It's got very big. We're using a lot of external data and so on and so forth. But I don't think Hadoop has any specific interest right now for OLTP, and I don't think it has any interest for Office applications. And pretty much all of the action that we come across is actually happening in the BI analytics space. So that's where the dynamite is. I'm now going to go and talk about architecture, unless you've got anything to say about all of that, Eric.
Well, I'd just throw out one comment. We got a comment from an audience member saying it's odd that you haven't mentioned Oracle yet in this conversation, and I guess it pays just to take a quick look at the big giants and just kind of wonder what's happening, because from my perspective, all of the big companies have been taking this very interesting, very ranging from cautious to strategic to nervous perspective or take on the Hadoop movement. Because clearly it does strike me that these component parts in this ecosystem, when combined properly, are going to start picking away at environments where traditionally you would see big vendors selling software. So if you look at the ODP, which you mentioned, of course, SAS and Teradata and IBM all got together with Hortonworks and a few other players as well, as what feels to me to be a sort of competition to the Apache Foundation, There's been a lot of buzz amongst the players in this space about all that, and a lot of, frankly, unfriendly dialogue going back and forth in social channels and elsewhere. So that's a very interesting take. And you look at Oracle and what they're doing. Of course, they're hedging their bets as well. All the big players are hedging their bets. And I thought, speaking of, you were talking about how you were changing your mind. I'm sort of changing my mind as well. I remember about a year and a half ago writing a piece for Techopedia in which I thought to myself, well, you know, here Cloudera is out there selling an actual product, an enterprise product, whereas Hortonworks, and of course neither of them are sponsors of this report, but they bear discussion because of the impact they have on the industry. And then the other one, of course, is MapR. But you've got Hortonworks going with the services-only game versus the play of selling enterprise software in a more traditional sense. And I'm watching all of this stuff happening, and I'm not sure where it's going to go myself, because initially I thought the big players like your IBMs, your Oracles, your SAS, your Teradata, and so forth were going to be able to very efficiently incorporate the advances in these technologies, and I think some of them are doing a really good job. I mean, at the risk of touting a couple sponsors, I've been watching Teradata and SAS very closely, and have been very interested to see how they deal with this wave of innovation. And from my perspective, they're doing some very clever things in terms of hedging bets, but also incorporating, because if something is open source, well, then anybody can use it, at least under the various licenses that are out there. But what's your take on the big giants versus these mammals? Are we looking at dinosaurs maybe being undone by mammals here, or what are your thoughts?
Well, I think that's going to happen in one way or another. I mean, it's very difficult to say. You know, I mean, you would have said, for instance, if you'd looked at it 3 or 4 years ago, you'd have said that Teradata would be one of the companies that are in trouble, but it's embraced Hadoop in a way that actually is unusual, you know. It's probably getting damaged in terms of license revenues, but it's bound to be the case also that IBM and Oracle are getting damaged. Everybody that makes an awful lot of money out of license fees from databases is going to get damaged in terms of that revenue stream, and there isn't any way that they can avoid it per se. They may be able to postpone it. They may be able to do some very clever things to put off the evil day, but, you know, the reality out there is that, you know, Hadoop is just getting stronger and stronger, and it is becoming, you know, the thing about the database, the data warehouse database was, you know, that the analytics always fed off that, and the BI tended to feed off that. Well, that stuff's starting to feed off Hadoop now, you know, and therefore, you know, even if you can't in one way or another, even if you're going to be able to retain the customers you've got in terms of the use of the data warehouse, because one of the problems with Hadoop is, despite all of this noise about it being parallel, it's goddamn slow, you know, and there's no way that it can compete with a really fast database. But those database revenues and those databases are probably not going to grow anything like the way that they did before. So everybody that's in that space and depends upon that are going to have to, in one way or another, bow down to whatever Hadoop turns into. But it's really difficult to say. You'd have to do, you know, I don't want to say anything specific about any specific vendor, other than the fact that they've all got a challenge and they're all going to meet it in some way or other, and I don't think they've got any choice but to actually align with Hadoop in some way or other, find a way of coexisting with Hadoop. I don't think there is any choice whatsoever for them.
Yeah, and I recognize St. Mark's Square, by the way. It's a beautiful place. Take it away.
Well, you've been there, right, but these people were there before you. Okay, you know, some architectural principles. The new atom of data is the event. We're in a different world. Scale up before you scale out. You know, Hadoop may be a great idea when you actually need to scale out, but if you can scale up before you scale out, you will do better. Right now, you can get 48 cores on a single server. You can get 1/4 of a terabyte of memory on a single server. You can get an awful lot of SSD on a single server. You can get 50 terabytes of data on spinning disk on a single server. If you can stick all of that on a single server, you could even run Hadoop on a single server. Then, you don't necessarily need the scale-out capabilities of Hadoop. And every year that goes by, the number of cores there and the amount of memory and the amount of SSD and the price of SSD and the amount of disk I/O that you can do, it's just only going to increase. So, I think that the scalability of the hardware is increasing faster than an awful lot of people in a market would ever get close to needing to use scale-out technology. So I think there's a whole category of companies that will never need to care about Hadoop. It may be that they'll use Hadoop technology. It may be that the Hadoop ecosystem will create stuff that works extremely well on single servers and that's all that they'll ever need to use. But, it isn't a done deal that everyone's going to scale out forever. It's only some companies where scale out is a big deal. You should take the processing to the data. If you can, that's a very good, it's actually becoming an imperative. But that means that you shouldn't just create big heaps of data for no good reason. If I've got Hadoop, therefore I shall collect petabytes of data is not really it's not really sequitur. Hadoop is only ever a component, not a solution. Right now, it is only a BI component. We didn't find any evidence of it being used in any really compelling way outside of the BI and analytics space. Here are the technology revolutions. I'm not going to go through them all. It's just that the last one is where we are. It's big data, it's parallel, it's distributed, it's event-driven. And if we're going to think in terms of Hadoop, then we have to think in terms of Hadoop and its existence in that world. We're bridging from the previous world, the service-oriented corporate data environment, to this event-driven world, and we will do so for another decade. It all happened with parallelism. I refer to this as the imp in the bottle that got out of the bottle. The multi-core chips enabled it. It changed the whole performance equation. We started to notice a couple of years ago, I remember speaking to you several times about it, Eric, that basically we were running into applications that are running 100 times, 1,000 times faster than ones, than we would have expected a few years before. Well, that was because of parallelism. Well, the parallelism doesn't go away. The thing that parallelism made a huge difference to was the big data world, because it could be applied so easily, and it didn't even need to be effective to make a difference. Well, it's going to be applied to everything. It's not just going to be the big data world that goes for parallelism. Everything's going to go for parallelism. All of the software, all of the development tools will be parallel in time. We will have parallel compilers and so on and so forth. This isn't going to stop. And that's another of the disruptive things if you actually, set aside the Hadoop situation. I actually put that slide in by accident, so I'll just go straight past it. I kind of talk to it. Hadoop has got no place whatsoever in the Internet of Things. You certainly can connect data together in a central hub, but you're not going to want to do anything other than aggregate data to a central hub. Pretty much all of the Internet of Things applications are actually distributed applications. So at best, Hadoop could be catching some of the data, but there's nothing compelling about Hadoop in the IoT at this point in time. And we've looked at a lot, as you know, Eric, we looked at a lot of IoT through the past year or so. This is the analytics business process. It's changed because of a number of things. There's more data than they ever had before. We've got parallel technology, so we don't really need to do the modeling cycle anything like as frequently as we needed to do before. We've got scalable software. We've got the open source tools, so the cost of doing this kind of thing has fallen. And we've got machine learning capability and an ability to parallelize it that allows us to often use machine learning where we might have had to use intelligent, if you like, data analysts to make decisions. So that's the analytics business process, and that's really what's being implemented. And that's why when we actually look through the architecture of Hadoop, we're actually looking at, I'll go back, we're actually looking at an architecture that's pretty much designed for that kind of process. We've influencing factors. There's Hadoop skills. There's a need to understand the new business process that this is creating. There's tool selection skills, there's architectural skills required. There's an appropriate budget that's not anorexic for doing things like this. And there needs to be time involved in adopting Hadoop into this kind of application space. But nevertheless, a lot of organizations have already done it, and a large number of organizations are pretty much committed to it as far as I understand it. The organization needs to understand the opportunity and commit at an organizational level, which probably means at the C level. It's talking about explorative capability as well as analytical capability. An awful lot of organizations never did either of those things, and they're now very easy to do and very inexpensive to do some pretty useful things in actual fact. Has to be able to implement and has to be willing to fund. This is, the typical Hadoop implementation, and it doesn't surprise me at all that it's the large organizations that are going for it. This is what I call the emerging spectrum of BI. There is a whole series of different response times that we're trying to meet. Aside from going from left to right, okay, we've got loads of data sources, and they're now variable, and they're now many, many more than there ever be before. But data passes through all of these applications. There has to be data preparation of one sort or another, so the data results are okay. Then there's real time, which is predictive. There's the human time stuff, which is predictive, but you're feeding human beings rather than a computer. Then there's in-time stuff, dashboard, drill by, that kind of thing, which is more of a traditional BI. And then there's data exploration, which is research activity, which has very large latencies, if you like. This is a kind of latency diagram, but that's the emerging spectrum of BI. I kind of think of BI and analytics as a completely different thing than I used to think of it. It's getting much richer than it ever was before. This is something that emerged during the research. There are problems with Hadoop as being the place to catch things. One of them is that if you're actually going to particularly encrypt data, then you really need to encrypt it on the way in, because once data is actually in Hadoop, it's recorded 3 times, and it's very difficult to delete it. So if you've got sensitive data and it's going to go into Hadoop, then you actually need to encrypt it on the way in if you're going to do encryption as a means of protecting the data. And if you're not, I would suggest that you think carefully as to why it is that you're not doing that, because encryption, given the level of security risk that exists now, is fairly compelling. So this starts to give us we've got these data sources on the left here, external and internal, either streams or files. We've got access and data capture into a staging area, and we apply a governance in the staging area on ingest, and then it goes into Hadoop. And there are other things we might want to do depending upon how we're using Hadoop and how we process the data flows within Hadoop or the data activity within Hadoop. But there's metadata capture. There's provenance and lineage of data, which is not avoidable anymore. And you pretty much can't guarantee the results of a lot of analytics unless you know the provenance and lineage of the data. The metadata capture is a trick and a half. That's one of the reasons I was pleased that Waterline sponsored it, because they've got some really neat stuff to do that kind of stuff, but it's not easy. Then, the Hadoop ingest, you may also be doing this stuff, the metadata management, the data catalog, creating a full data catalog of everything in Hadoop. If you don't have that, you already have a data swamp. You don't have a data lake at all. Data cleansing, data lineage, all of that stuff has got to be, and of course it's got to have access security for it, but all of that stuff has got to be sorted out on as you ingest the data. You'll see at the bottom that I have something I've just called the data analytics engine. You might call that a data warehouse, but this is just acknowledging the fact that all the evidence suggests to me that Hadoop isn't actually particularly fast at all. A lot of very important activities. And the traditional data warehouses, or actually even new products that are built, like the Vertica, that are built for getting you fast answers to particularly analytic loads, will actually have to accompany Hadoop wherever it goes in my opinion, for quite a long time. Certainly, there are some interesting things. Action did a really interesting thing by putting vector-wise on Hadoop. So, you could possibly include vector-wise in that, but I would still separate it out and say, well, it's a data analytics engine of a kind, really, rather than vanilla Hadoop. This is the primary applications, and look, as I drew this, apart from the fact that you're going to have arrows going off to other applications elsewhere in the corporate environment, it really turns out to be analytics development, analytics audit, analytics operations, and BI applications are just pretty much the main kinds of activities that are going on. There's more than that, but that's where all of the action seems to be happening. We've got the fact that Hadoop can be a data hub. So if you take the Hadoop stack, and we have the idea of an analytics engine in the middle, but it's from data sources to destinations. There will be a need to pass some of the data that goes through Hadoop into data self-service or into the OLTP or the Office systems or external systems. There's a kind of Hadoop starts to become the corporate record, and it definitely becomes the archive for the organization, at least in all of the areas of BI, which probably means OLTP. But in the end, I think it'll pull in the Office systems as well. It becomes, in one way or another, a data storage environment. But I don't think that if you're using Hadoop to do archive, I don't think that you would have just one instance of Hadoop. I think you would have an archive instance of Hadoop as well as Hadoop on its own. No matter how fast Hadoop is, you don't want to actually clog it up with archive data. And then there's a management, and this is as we have seen before, but it's worth knowing that there needs to be performance management going on in Hadoop. Part of it is making sure the right things in the data analytics engine, and part of it is actually just normal system management stuff, making sure that the hardware is there in one way or another in order to deal with the capacity of the data as it grows, making sure that there's a reasonable balance between the service given by the analytics engine and the service given by the Hadoop stack and so on and so forth. And you've got the data lifecycle management there, which implies I almost drew a separate Hadoop for archive, but some people are not using it separately for archive at this point in time, so maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Okay, Hadoop going forward. Anything you want to say about any of that, Eric?
Yeah, I'll just kind of throw in one comment I'm getting from actually a couple different attendees on this whole concept of data cleansing and data governance and data mastering, which would seem to be something you'd want to do on ingest or before ingest as opposed to trying to sort that out on the other side. You mentioned Waterline, and I know there are some other tools out there which are trying to work on categorizing things and metadata management, but it does strike me as though the metadata component was like security, a bit of an afterthought, but what do you think?
Well, I think that's correct too, and especially when schema on read became a very popular thing. And it's like there's a very good reason for schema on read. I mean, in some instances, the data you actually could just with a little bit of logic deduce exactly what you got in your hands, and therefore you could do schema on read, you could drop stuff in. But you can't do schema on read as a kind of without thinking about it. A decision's got to be made. And there's another thing that's worth mentioning here, which may not have been or may have been in the questions that have come from the audience here. But one of the things that you aren't going to do MDM on ingest. And there's two reasons for that. One is that Hadoop will create its own data. You may in one way or another create data that is derived from the data that came into Hadoop, right? And that data also is covered by MDM. So if you can capture some of the MDM stuff on ingest, that's a really good idea. And certainly if you can capture as much metadata as possible on ingest, that's an excellent idea. But you're going to have an ongoing task that sits over this scalable file system to keep all of that stuff fresh and to keep the MDM activity going on. And I think that's worth doing personally.
Okay, good. Take it away.
Okay, Hadoop going forward, and I've only got another 5 minutes, let's say. But this is the smallest section of the presentation anyway. The technology layers, we discussed this when we started out, and I wanted to make a few comments about Hadoop as I now see it. But, for those that weren't listening to the original broadcast, we have this map, which is, hardware, then the OS, then the data management, then the development software, and then the applications and the services, and these form, if you like, technology layers. And the buying impulse is to go down the stack, which is if you can buy something as a service, then don't bother buying applications or anything else, just buy the service. If there's something isn't available as a service, then try and buy the application. So, you're going to Salesforce.com or some other company because it's got the applications you need, and you don't really need to actually worry about anything else. But if the applications aren't a good enough fit, then you will need development software in order to, in one way or another, build the applications. And because of that, almost directly, you're going to need data management software to look after the data flows from the applications that you've built. So you are into database technology. At that point in time, you're going to have to choose your platform for the database technology, which means you're into an OS and you're into hardware. And it may be that the thing that you want to do will only work on, Cray. Cray's still out there doing all of this high-performance computing, You could go all the way down the stack, but the buying impulse starts at the top and it only descends if it has to. Unfortunately, technology change rises from the bottom, in the sense that pretty much, a very large amount of what's actually happened that's disrupted our world in the past 5 to 10 years actually happened in the hardware layer, but some of it has actually happened in the operating system layer. Particularly now that we've got Hadoop, and Hadoop has got some of the characteristics of an operating system. That kind of disruption is happening via Hadoop. So, the technology, because of the hardware changes, you do things to the OS. You will do things to database or file systems. You will do things to development software to keep it all in step. And at the same time, disruption can actually happen in any layer, in the sense that anybody that's operating as a vendor in any particular layer may find a new way of doing it, a new way of using the technology that makes that layer up, and therefore innovate in that layer, and therefore that kind of disruption will travel up the stack. So, technology change travels up the stack, and so does disruption. But the buying impulse comes down, and that creates the world that we live in. So the question really is, so what about Hadoop? Well, Hadoop started life as development software and data management software, But, the data management software is descending into the OS environment, and it may descend all the way into the hardware, depending upon how Hadoop it actually develops. There'll be various vendors out there that want to sell the iron, or cloud vendors who want to provision the iron that runs Hadoop, who may actually start innovating in those particular layers, in which case the innovation will go down as well as up. And also, the disruption is going up as well. We've completely seen, we've seen the complete disruption of the whole of BI and analytics, as far as I'm concerned. It's not that loads of different vendors have been destroyed, but they all had to run very, very fast in order to keep pace with what was actually happening in the world. And those that don't run fast enough are probably suffering from that. So this is kind of where Hadoop threaded its way into the story. And it's migrating through the stack as we go. This was Hadoop as an OS. This was my original idea, that Hadoop would become an OS. My opinion now is it's only going to remain a platform. I don't think it's going to be an OS because, if you're being ruled by a ship of fools, you've not got the coherence to create an operating system environment that is dependable for a large number of corporations, And I don't think that, in one way or another, I think that the various Hadoop vendors, Hortonworks and Mapr and Cloudera, they're going to have to stay fairly close together, or else they're going to they run the risk of someone saying, you're way too out of line for us to want to deal with you. So until we get a resolution to that, I don't think Hadoop is an OS. It has the potential to become an OS. It would be the first distributed OS, but there isn't an OS for it to replace. So it hasn't got this kind of knockout effect of there exists a distributed OS and this one's going to take it away. So, I mean, that's my feeling about Hadoop as an OS right now. Probably not in the near future is what I would say. Events and event data, I just wanted to point out this. The event data itself, time, geographic location, virtual logical location, source device ID, the actors involved, and then the data. You've got about 6. Yeah, we've got 6 different indexes here for event data. And my reason for pointing this out is that nobody's building systems like this except for 1 or 2 people I've talked to that actually index all of this stuff. So I'm saying that the data itself at the moment is not actually being prepared for the world that's coming. And that means that there'll also be an adjustment as that happens. There's that. Omen's important. The architectural principles still apply. Hadoop is BI and analytics. But what else actually needs Hadoop? And there are some, very, very large problems that involve an awful lot of high-performance computing where Hadoop may well be the platform that isn't necessarily that data-heavy, much more process-heavy, and I would think that Hadoop will probably slip into that, but it's like, I don't think anything else needs Hadoop in a way that, if you think about it, when Windows came into existence, a vast number, an avalanche of applications that it could do, and Windows, of course, tried to expand and get as big as you could get. Only ever got to be a server OS, really. But you're looking at Hadoop, and I'm thinking, well, what else is it going to do? And I'm not 100% certain. But first of all, I think that data in motion beats data at rest. I think that there is going to be event-driven architectures that are based on data in motion rather than data at rest. And then we've got this thing about the biological system that I have been repeating time and again through various presentations I've been doing. But the human control system, almost instant reflex and swift response, and then there's a considered response. Well, what Hadoop does well is it does the considered response. If you want an instant reflex or you want a swift response, Hadoop might well do swift response, but actually you purpose-built, highly parallelized tools, those are the things you want for the instant reflex, where the latency really, really matters. And Hadoop is never going to challenge those, I don't think. So I don't think Hadoop's going to become a streaming engine. I think it's going to become the engine of, the big data heap. And that's probably where it'll stay. I don't see, until I see some evidence of anything else, I don't see it, basically. This is Hadoop in a hexagon. I only included this so that those people that are actually thinking about Hadoop just have 12 dimensions to consider when they do it. We talked about this in the first presentation, but I'm not going to say anything else about it now, other than if you're actually looking at Hadoop strategically, then this is a reasonably good way of looking at it in order that you actually get to think about everything that needs to be thought about. And that's it. And I think I've talked about the landscape and some architecture, and I've guessed where it's going. How about that?
Very nice. We had another good comment from an attendee who talked about the importance of networking these days in the Hadoop world, of course, because everything goes over IP. And we're seeing this now in a lot of other places, too. You see companies doing this software-defined networking, for example, a lot of innovation in that networking space. And that's obviously a critical component to consider, right?
Oh, yeah. The network, and I mean, and that's another, if you like, that's another thing that, if we're going to talk about the disruptions that have occurred in the world, even though we talked about the fact that we did things in silos much more than we thought we did, right? So when the networking guys. I mean, Cisco obviously was the big networking giant, right? We never built systems to run over networks. We either built communication systems, which were, pretty much network-based systems, or else we built things in silos. We didn't build things to integrate over networks, and we've never done that. And we don't really know how to do that particularly well. That's where Cisco was actually going with its big switches. Was let's just start plugging servers into the big switches wherever they need to be. And I kind of agree with that. And when I talk about data in motion, I kind of think that an awful lot of things can be done while in motion. In other words, your analog is the digital signal processor. The processor that sits on a telephone line and processes the stuff as it goes past. It might divide it into packets and route it and stuff like that. But it's processing it without putting any latency into the situation or with very little. Well, we can do an awful lot of the processing that we do that way. So I don't think that the networking game is over. I think the networking game is going to be, in itself, that's going to introduce disruptive factors into the way that things do. Right now, there's an awful lot of reason not to go out of one server if you can avoid doing it. If you've got a lot of servers, if you need a lot of servers, more than one, as soon as you've got two, you've got a network. The network's going to be slower going through the network to another processor. You probably want really fast networking between the big, Hadoop cluster itself. You want fastest fiber optics you can get to do that, so that it's as if that it wasn't going through a network. And then there's a second network, so you're left with hierarchical networking as you had before. You've got the fast network and the slow. But it's not that simple, because you've got other things like, we probably will need to distribute Hadoop as well. We probably need to have 3 or 4 instances of Hadoop over the world. Some organizations will need that. They might want that for disaster recovery alone, for example. Well, if you're going to do that, then there's an awful lot of data that's going to have to travel. And those are things to think about. I'm sure they're things that people at Facebook and people at Yahoo and people at Google think about.
Yeah, and we got a couple of questions around cloud. I'm going to push this older slide here to talk about it for just a couple of seconds and talk about Databricks with respect to Spark and so forth. But a couple questions here about cloud computing, and I just have to ask myself, as I look at many of these prodigious cloud vendors, and of course I spend a lot of time in the marketing world, so software as a service and tools like iContact and Constant Contact, and there are lots of them out there, MailChimp, of course, WebEx. You have all these different cloud players in different spaces. People are asking, why don't we see more adoption in the cloud world? I guess what I would say is, well, we just really kind of don't know. I think that some of the big cloud vendors are, in fact, leveraging HDFS for different parts of the stack here. But it is an interesting question. And you talk about adoption. Certainly these born of data companies, your Twitters, LinkedIn, all these guys that are spinning out of the valley mostly, are definitely leading the charge here with this technology, and also the analytics players, of course, media companies. But if you talk about penetration into brick-and-mortar industries, from people I talk to, it's kind of a far cry still. But what do you think about cloud adoption for Hadoop and moving outside of just, let's call it, the internet companies and the government agencies? Of course, the three-letter word agencies are dumping millions of dollars.
Yeah, right. You've got the banks. The banks are all into Hadoop, and you've got the telcos. They're all into Hadoop as well. So it's some of the retailers, the bigger retailers, are into Hadoop. But it's the big guys. It's like if you happen to be in the Fortune 500 or whatever, it probably doesn't matter what sector you're in. You're probably doing some Hadoop. It's that you have probably the data volumes where it matters. So if all that you were actually doing were archiving to Hadoop, then there would be sense in it. But you're probably going to do much more than that. I think that's happening. The thing that we encountered a lot of, the cloud vendors are not particularly competitive in the Hadoop space, and that's a problem. And the problem there is that they aren't, at this point in time, picking up the business, because when people actually do, just cost evaluations for setting up a Hadoop cluster, it just becomes an awful lot less expensive to actually do it at home in the data center than to stick it into the cloud. That's probably not going to stay that way forever, but there is also the fact that once you've got petabytes of data, you really don't move them. There's no point. The networks are too slow. You're not going to move them. So there's a certain kind of thing. Data's getting to the place where it's probably going to stay. I think the word data gravity here. A lot of these data heaps ain't moving easily.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Data does have gravity. We've talked about that on many shows before, and I think you're going to see a lot of these cloud environments stay in the cloud, whereas a lot of these on-prem environments are going to stay on-prem, and you're going to have this really dichotomous world going forward for some time. And I threw up this slide as well just because I want to reiterate the point that you made, actually, something like maybe a year ago, in fact, that the innovation wave is not over, and that's before Kafka came out. So this is it's an infectious movement that we see out there in the world of enterprise computing, and it seems to me it's going to have far-reaching effects for many years to come, and it's going to be hard to figure out where that goes, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing that actually, what we could do, if you looked at all of the research programs we'd done prior to this year, we could come to the end of the research program and make statements that were reasonably coherent in the sense of it's obvious the momentum and the direction and everything that it's obvious where it's heading. Suddenly it's not obvious where it's heading. If some large vendor that we didn't actually realize was doing something fairly sophisticated, so you would be thinking about a Facebook or a Yahoo or a Google or something, suddenly decides that they're going to throw something into the open source space that actually, does something really, really useful and scales up beyond your wildest dreams. People are talking about, one of the reasons that everybody went to the column store databases was that the normal traditional relational databases way didn't scale, and that was before Hadoop came along, giving you the levels of scalability you could only previously have dreamed about in terms of the number of servers you could put together in a cluster. Mm-hmm. But it's like we have no idea what's coming. At this point in time, we have no idea what's coming. And the other thing is, it's all come from the valley, which is another thing. It's like, who knows what's going to happen in the large Indian or Chinese web businesses that get created. They might do stuff of their own and suddenly drop stuff in, I'm sure that they're extremely in favor of open source.
Yeah, it's just such a fast-moving environment, and it makes things very exciting, to say the very least. So that's good news for us in our industry trying to stay on top of things. I've heard even from industry analysts, people who work their whole day on this kind of stuff, that it's hard to keep up. It's hard to stay on top of all these different moving parts, and it remains to be seen where it's all going to go in the end. But, folks, we do appreciate all of your time today. We're going to release an archive of this webcast shortly, probably in a couple of days. Also, the full report is going to be coming out. Watch for that at insideanalysis.com. And, of course, we're going to continue our research here at the Bloor Group. You can rest assured that Hadoop is going to remain top of mind. And this whole ecosystem, really, it's not just HDFS. It's all these different components coming together, and it is just a bewildering world. I'm a big fan of Drill, for example. I'm very curious to see where that goes. It's a very interesting sort of dynamic schema-generating engine where you don't have to think about the schema beforehand. It'll come up with some ideas for you. I think we're going to see a lot more of that going forward as companies that work on these technologies learn about the different patterns in the data. Of course, this whole Internet of Things, all the connectedness in the world today of information and data. It's going to be a lot of fun. So big thanks to Dr. Robin Bloor. Big thanks once again to all of our sponsors there. You can see them listed here. And like I say, watch for that report. It's coming soon. And watch for later this year, we're going to talk about the modern data warehouse. So with that, folks, we're going to bid you farewell. Goodness gracious, thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun. we'll talk to you hopefully tomorrow. We got another webcast tomorrow, Hot Tech with Snowflake Computing, data warehouse in the cloud. Speaking of, hope you can check us out for that one, folks. Until then, we'll catch up to you later. Bye-bye.